Mr. Chairman. I am certainly excited to hear from two of my friends, actually, and two people who do some tremendous work on the Cook County Board, and that is none other than Commissioner Scott Britton and my own Commissioner, Brandon Johnson. So the 4th of July holiday weekend is right around the corner, and finally our world is opening up after COVID, thankfully. I know we're looking forward to celebrating with friends. I certainly am, or just to sit in the backyard and cool out, okay, without a mask. Now, before we get to that happy place, though, I want to take some time to focus on a really important issue that we all need to be concerned about. And this month, we're going to be talking about housing matters. So, no matter where you live or what you do, housing matters. It does. And housing even matters more because we all got to go somewhere. And there are some people who do not have a place to live. And you know that our club, we have members who support all kinds of issues, but one of them is housing. And for those who are live in underserved areas and the homeless. So housing, when I say underserved communities, I'm thinking about communities that have these increased levels of vacant property, blight, and foreclosure. Now, housing issues aren't a direct responsibility of my office, but let me just say, and I have it posted here, and I'm going to make sure that these two commissioners get a copy of this study that was done that talks about the plunder of Black wealth in Chicago. This was primarily on the west side and the south side of Chicago. It was called the Contract Buyers League, and these people fought tooth and nail just to have a decent place to live. And if you ever read, anybody who wants a copy of this, certainly I'd be happy to share it with you. But this is what I'm passionate about. You said, well, what does the clerk's office have to do with this? Well, we record these documents, and we saw an uptick a few years ago of people getting buying homes on contract. This is a relic of the 1950s, and we were concerned about this because, if it's rearing its ugly head again, then we need to be prepared and make sure people don't lose their homes. Housing certainly is foundational. Housing for many people, all they have is their home, their car, and their bank account. And they use their home. They may, send their kids to school or whatever. But anyway, so housing is near and dear to my heart. And I am still working very diligently on this whole issue of what's happening in communities. Now, last week we partnered with the Land Bank and for a Zoom presentation to hear about the work that they're doing to promote redevelopment of vacant, abandoned, and foreclosed or tax delinquent properties. We also discussed the efforts that the Land Bank is making to stabilize neighborhoods and to stimulate residential, commercial, and industrial development. I encourage all of you to connect with the Land Bank or visit their website to see about more information that's there about what they're doing in Cook County. So again, I want to say that housing does matter, and it really matters to the gentlemen who are with me today. So Commissioner Scott Britton, he serves as the commissioner of the 14th district in Cook County, and that includes communities in our north and northwest suburbs. Brandon Johnson serves as commissioner of the 1st district, which includes communities on the west side of Chicago and the western suburbs. And of course, he happens to be my commissioner, but they're all my commissioners because I work very closely with each and every one of them on all kinds of issues. Now, these two gentlemen were the sponsors of the county's first residential tenant landlord ordinance, which was recently approved by the county board. This ordinance, for the first time ever, provides protections for suburban renter households and their landlords. Commissioner Johnson was the chief sponsor of the county's Just Housing Amendment, which protects renters from discrimination based on past arrest records. So the first thing I want to do is start off by asking each of you to just give us a brief introduction. Tell us a little bit about your background, the work you've done on housing initiatives, because housing matters.
Well, thank you, Karen. I guess I'll start off because age before beauty, Brandon. And by the way, you know, being on a panel with Brandon is kind of like stepping on the court with Steph Curry. It's not going to go well for me. So luckily, it's not one-on-one. We're on the same team. But you know, I do want to thank you for having me here today. This has been a real eye-opener for me on housing issues when I started the process of the RTLO, and of course was a strong supporter of Brandon's just housing requirements as well. All of this, I think, ties into the work that Karen has done and President Preckwinkle on trying to expand justice and opportunities throughout suburban Cook County. There's a lot of stuff going on that I think that we have tried to lead on since Brandon and I have been on the board, and certainly Karen is kind of our lodestar on all these issues because she knows where all the bodies are buried. That helps us try and figure out how to get things done for ordinary folks. So I want to thank you for having me, and I do have a presentation, but I'll let Brandon weigh in first and we can get going.
And thank you, Commissioner Britton. And of course, Clerk Yarbrough, I really appreciate your leadership and what it's meant for me personally, but also what your leadership has meant for the entire county of Cook and really throughout the state of Illinois. And this issue is absolutely critical in this moment. And I'll be very direct here. The long history of housing, or the lack thereof, and its role in perpetuating structural inequality and particularly structural racism has a deep, deep history here in Chicago and Cook County. And so before I became a Cook County Commissioner, many of you already know that I was a public school teacher. And I taught in a school district here in Chicago where thousands of students were homeless. One of my most provoking conversations I've ever had as a teacher was with a student of mine during a lesson that I was instructing or facilitating, and it was around a family that was homeless. But here was the kicker. The family that was homeless was staying with other relatives. And one of my students came up to me and asked me if she was homeless. And I said, I can't answer that for you. And the reason why she asked that is because her family had been staying with their family, their cousins. But it was such a regular part of their existence, she never saw that situation as without housing or homeless. And so it's not just the documented families that are homeless, but it's also the families that are not documented because they are living with other relatives. What we also recognize, that what I saw as a public school teacher and what motivated me to, quite frankly, run for the Cook County Board of Commissioners, was that we have an opportunity, and a unique opportunity as commissioners, to create more opportunities, to break down barriers that have prevented people from accessing something that is so critical to not just their humanity, but to Clerk Yarbrough's point, so critical to generational wealth. And so as we see the isolation of poverty and how debilitating it can be, there's a direct link between housing being denied and families being segregated, to families not having access to affordable homes as well. And that's been through the systemic dismantling of even public housing. So I'm looking forward to Commissioner Britton's presentation and all the discussion around how we can not only work to create more opportunities for people to have access to affordable housing, but we're breaking down the barriers of individuals who are formerly incarcerated, or those that are struggling to make ends meet every single day, where 50% at the very least of Cook County residents cannot afford to pay rent here in Cook County. That we have to break down those barriers and continue to create opportunities for equity and justice. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Britton, you have a presentation. You know how to share your screen?
All right, so there I am. Okay. So my purpose today is to give you the quick version of what the RTLO provides. And first off, that's my smiling face, and we can go to the next slide. So the reason this was brought up to me is that in 1986, under Mayor Washington's leadership, the city of Chicago got a renters or tenants' rights ordinance placed applicable only to the city of Chicago. There are a couple other suburbs that do have these types of ordinances. However, the vast majority of 245,000 suburban renters, that's 43%, are renters in suburban Cook, had no real protections as to landlords. So the thing that we also found out is that 64% of those individuals are low income. And we've also learned, and I know Brandon would certainly be aware of this, that a lot of these individuals are individuals of color, a lot of single mothers, a lot of people who have limited resources, who were being very badly served by their landlords. And this came up to me because I had a group of people, 50 people in unincorporated Glenview in the northern suburbs, come to me and say that they were on fixed incomes and they were not being treated very fairly by their landlord. That's what was the genesis of my proposing this RTLO. So this is really just designed to give basic protections to our renters that have already existed for over 35 years in the city of Chicago. You go to the next slide. So the ordinance itself went into effect in full on June 1st of 2021. There was another provision, a lockout provision, which has been in effect since it was passed in January. But at this point, there are certain units that are accepted. We did that because of what we learned from the Chicago ordinance, which is that there are a lot of smaller mom and pop type operations that just really weren't able to comply with some of these and became a burden. And therefore we made exceptions. Transient hotels, dormitories, certain single family homes where someone has lived and they've gone to a nursing home and they may not be able to sell, so they're going to rent for a short period of time. Those types of properties are exempt. You can go to the next slide. And what was really shocking to me is that there was a lot of stuff going on in suburban Cook County, which I thought was profoundly unfair, particularly for people who couldn't afford a lawyer, which is just about everybody that I talked to. There were provisions about confessing judgment, which basically means you admit your fault before the case even starts in court. There were limitations on jury trials. There were limitations on what you could say about your landlord. You know, First Amendment violations, basically, although privately held, so legal unless there's a statute that prohibits it. And I eliminated basically along with Brandon and the board, the idea that you would have to pay attorney's fees of the landlord. There are provisions here that provide attorney's fees for tenants, which makes the playing field a little more even. You can go to the next slide. So lockouts have always been prohibited without a court order, but it was never really enforced in a way that I think it should have been. So at this point, we now have it codified directly in the ordinance where you cannot lock someone out, which basically means you put a lock on the door, throw their stuff out in the street, and they're homeless, which is exactly what Brandon was talking about earlier. So if that happens, you should call your local police department in the suburbs, and they should be able to get you back in your home. Go to the next slide. There are various notices that were basically up to the landlord. They are now limited, very similar to the Chicago Tenants' Rights Ordinance. There are also provisions where, if someone abandons the property, there was really no mechanism, which I think helps both the landlord and the tenant, as to how you can get rid of the property that's in there. You can't just throw it away or keep it yourself. There are provisions as to what you can or cannot do. Also, I had landlords just walking into their tenants' apartments whenever they felt like it. There are limits on that except for emergencies, so that people aren't just walking into your place unannounced. Go to the next slide. We talk a lot about habitable units. This is really just basic stuff like water, no holes in the walls. Certain temperatures are required for a winter time, and pest controls. Pest control services have to be brought in if there's bed bugs. Again, trying to keep these places livable for those people who are having a hard time, probably as it is, in the current economic circumstances. So you can go to the next slide. The other thing that I thought was important was to have a provision whereby if there's a repair that needs to be done, and it's a relatively minor, not like rebuilding the whole house, but if you have an air conditioner that goes on the fritz or your furnace doesn't work and the landlord doesn't do anything about it, in the suburbs, there was really nothing you could do. Now you can make those minor repairs and take the repair cost off your rent, which as long as you give copies of the receipts to your landlord, I think that's really going to help. And you don't have to have a lawyer to do that. You can do it on your own. And there are other, there are still requirements that tenants not disturb the other tenants. There are things that you have to abide by, municipal codes, those kinds of things. So this is not just a one-sided ordinance. It does help landlords as well to define their rights and responsibilities. And you can go to the next slide. Again, if the unit's abandoned, there are specific provisions in the ordinance that allows that property to be sold, applied to rent, various things. And again, whenever, I got a lot of pushback from realtors and landlords on this ordinance. Brandon heard from a lot of them as well, saying, you're not doing anything for me. Well, we really did try to listen. We had, I think, over 40 changes to this ordinance in discussions with the landlord groups. And one of these was what we do with abandoned and destroyed property. You can go to the next slide. So there are things that the tenants will have a right to know. They'll have a right to know who they're renting from. Estimated utility costs, so you can figure out whether you can afford the place going forward. If there's any building code violations, there's also, if the property's been foreclosed on, you might get kicked out because of that. You're allowed to know that. Lead hazards, all the rules and regulations have to be in writing. One thing we did define was that landlords were using move-in fees in lieu of security deposits. So they charge $3,000 as a move-in fee, which they don't have to give back, but not have a security deposit and use it for that purpose. That is not what a move-in fee is designed to do. Move-in fees have to be related to some actual expense of the landlord in doing security or doing lock changes or whatever, but they have to be itemized, or have to at least be given a summary of those costs as a renter in suburban Cook. You can go to the next slide. Again, the tenants have responsibilities, and one of the things we put in that doesn't exist in the Chicago ordinance is you do have an obligation to give notice to the landlord as to problems that may exist, and they then have a right to cure, which is what we say in the law, which is that they can make changes and do what they're supposed to be doing within 2 business days. They also have to maintain your security deposit in a designated account, and then basically you're still obligated to be at least an acceptable neighbor, if not a friendly neighbor, as we put on this slide, and make sure that your property is not abandoned. You can go to the next slide. So one thing that we dealt with a lot were late fees. And one thing I learned during this process is that people who don't pay their rent don't pay it because they don't have any money, not because they're afraid of late fees. But late fees can then just spiral into kind of the cycle of poverty because you can't afford the rent, and now you have late fees that you can't afford either, and it just continues to increase. So there are limits on late fees, $10 for the first $1,000, and then 5% of the overall rent above $1,000. So if you have a property that you're renting out for $5,000, and good for you, it can be, the late fee can be 5% over the first $1,000. That's a substantial late fee. And they can apply that to rent. Now this, no, you can, I'm sorry, go ahead, go to the next one. Now this is a very busy slide, so I'm not going to go through everything, but this is a kind of a summary of everything that's on here that I think is most relevant to what we're talking about. And my suggestion would be that if anybody is curious, whether you be someone who rents a property or you're a tenant in suburban Cook, you can just search Cook County RTLO in a Google search, and you will come to the Cook County webpage, which will list a summary of all of these provisions. It will give people phone numbers that they can call for legal aid societies and groups that would be able to help you if your landlord is not complying with the provisions that are contained here. And by the way, the mechanism for enforcement of this is not the sheriff's office, it's not the Cook County Board, it is a private action, because if you are subject to one of these bad actor landlords and they don't comply with the provisions within this tenant remedies section, you can get attorney's fees, which is why your attorneys will take the cases. And that will also be an incentive for the landlord to deal with this issue, even if the amount of dollars in controversy is relatively low. Attorney's fees can build up very quickly. I know, I'm a lawyer myself, and landlords are not going to do that. They're going to want to try and fix the problem rather than pay your attorney's fees. And that, I think, is going to be a very useful enforcement mechanism going forward. You can go to the next slide. So again, we have a lot of resources in the county. We've just stood up the Cook County Legal Aid for Housing and Debt group, which will provide mediation services and contacts with lawyers. The eviction moratorium is still in place. It's going to be lifted soon. It barely survived in the Supreme Court this week, but I think that once that happens, we have put in place resources that will be able to help those individuals, both in the mortgage context and in rental properties, that will help you. Also, legal aid, North Suburban Legal Aid, which is up by me, and Carpels, they all will provide assistance to all of you who might need help. So please get this information out to those you know. We've done substantial outreach. The landlords and the realtors haven't helped that much, but I've tried. But I am getting this information out, like in forms like this, as much as I can, because this resource is in place. It is useful, and I hope people will take advantage of it to make things a little bit more fair, particularly for people who are not living in a $5,000 a month apartment in suburban Cook. And that's my presentation. And that's me.
There's a lot of information here, Commissioner, and this is good information. I mean, great information, quite frankly. So your counterpart here, did you have something you wanted to add, Commissioner Johnson? Because
yes, absolutely.
I have a couple of questions, and we'll open it up for questions from our audience. Go right ahead.
Yes. So it's been a real honor, honestly, working alongside people like Commissioner Britton to tackle this issue of housing justice. And one of the first things that I introduced and was happy to be the chief sponsor on was the Just Housing Ordinance, or the Just Housing Amendment. And essentially what the amendment did was it created an opportunity for individuals who were formerly incarcerated to have a fair shot at housing. Why is that critical? Just in the first district alone, anywhere from 1,500 to 3,000 folks are returning to the first district who've been in jail or in prison. So in other words, they're our neighbors anyways, right? And one of the challenges, of course, that our neighbors are having is being able to find good housing that's affordable. And not to mention housing where individuals will actually rent to them. If we're going to tackle the issue of really having safe communities, we can't do that if we're not creating opportunities, or at the very least, dismantling barriers that are preventing folks from full rehabilitation. If folks can't find housing, how do you expect them to find a job, right? If they find a job and then the housing is too expensive, how do you expect them to be sustained, productive residents of not just our district, but throughout Cook County? So we wanted to make sure that, again, our neighbors had a fair shot at accessing housing. And so what the amendment does is that before someone's background can be considered in a decision for housing, the landlord has to establish whether or not this individual has the ability to pay. See, because what was happening before this amendment took shape, individuals were being denied simply on the basis of their background, which I just find unconscionable, to think that we're in a society where individuals have paid their debt, and we are essentially, constantly tagging them for past mistakes. So once this individual has the ability to demonstrate that they can pay, a landlord could obviously at that point seek an understanding of their background, right? So a landlord could deny someone on the basis of a conviction, if they so choose. So this is where the amendment, I think, is actually quite useful. If a landlord decides to look at someone's background, because it's not required, it's at that point, that background has to be, that background check in which the landlord has made a decision not to rent to this individual, that landlord has to make that background check available for full transparency. And here's why. Sometimes systems get it wrong. Now we know our clerk has to deal with lots of records, and she gets all of it right, all the time.
I have employees, okay?
Exactly, right? So you have humans conducting the work. And so I can say is having a name like Brandon Johnson, believe it or not, that's actually a relatively common name. So there actually is a Brandon Johnson who lives in the first district that has a background. How do I know that? Because
I know how you know.
sometimes I get pulled over, right? And the thing that distinguishes me from this particular Brandon Johnson, our social security numbers are actually quite close. But what distinguishes me is that he's 150 pounds. And I haven't been 150 pounds, Karen, since 7th grade, right? But the point is that human error takes place, right? So what it also does is that once the background check is made transparent, it gives the opportunity for the landlord as well as the potential tenant to have a dialogue, right? And it's at that point where a decision can be made, where someone who said, like, look, yeah, that was me. But here's how I've demonstrated that I am, a productive resident of Cook County. And then it's at that point, if the landlord still decides to go into a different direction, there's a criteria and there's an explanation that they have to offer. And there could be some things that, require some special consideration. But what I want to be clear about is that this amendment has opened up opportunities for millions of families across Cook County, quite frankly, that have been denied housing otherwise. The last thing that I'll say is I just think it's important to note, particularly with this group, in the first district alone, in 2019, 80% of individuals who returned to the first district who were formerly incarcerated were women, Black women. So when we talk about my experience as a public school teacher, where 87% of Black children in particular, their homes are headed by women. To deny housing, it should be no wonder why there's 25,000 homeless students in the city of Chicago. You can make a direct correlation between housing barriers, poverty, and individuals that have a background. You can make a direct correlation between that circumstance or those circumstances and conditions and the lack of access to housing. So it's been a real honor, and I've been incredibly humbled by the opportunity to create housing opportunities for families, but more importantly, or I shouldn't say more importantly, but just as important, we gotta break down those barriers that continue to stratify our communities and locking people out of access to, let's be very clear to what Clerk Yarbrough said, denying people access to generational wealth. It's the first major purchase that my wife and I made. We bought our home in Austin. The last thing that I'll say is that my wife and I, both of whom have master's degrees plus, dedicated our lives to public service. We needed support from the government to purchase our first home. Now, everyone said we did everything right. And we believe that we did. But housing has become so out of reach for Black families in particular, that even individuals with degrees who have decent paying jobs still needed support from the government in order to be in a home. And I was serving the public every single day as a public school teacher, in which I'm required to live in Chicago. And on my salary alone, I could not afford to buy a home in Chicago. And so Cook County has been leading the way on this. And the reason why this is critically important, teachers in San Francisco right now are almost making $100,000 a year, and they cannot afford to live in San Francisco. And those families are actually qualifying for subsidies at $100,000 a year. And so as housing becomes more expensive, the average price of a home in Los Angeles and San Francisco, we're talking $900,000, to Commissioner Britton's point, $5,000 a month to rent. If we don't do something with all due expediency and urgency, not only are you going to see a greater stratification exist within our communities, you're going to see people forced out of our neighborhoods, and that ain't a good thing. So thank you, Madam Clerk.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Commissioner Kevin Morrison was supposed to be a part of this panel. This was supposed to be a 3-person panel, and he had another event that he had to participate in. But let me just say this, you know, you, Commissioner Johnson and Commissioner Britton and Commissioner Morrison are brand new on the county board, and you came on the board ready to get something done. And you kind of remind me of a friend of mine who went to Springfield and started addressing things that should have been addressed a long time ago. So I'm really thrilled that you all have taken on this housing issue. I mean, it's not hiding, it's there. It needs to be addressed, and I'm really proud of the work that you've done. I mean, you've done some other work as well, but I told you, housing is a focal point of mine. So, and you mentioned something too, Commissioner Johnson, about the government. So, you know, during the 50s and 60s, the government, the federal government, was complicit in keeping people from getting mortgages and what have you. So, you know, we have to keep a watch on, you know, exactly what's going on everywhere. So let's talk about fair housing for one moment. Why is it important to all of us? Why is fair housing important to all of us? Commissioner Britton, why is it important to you?
So Karen, you know, I've been, now this is almost, I guess, my 20th year as an elected official. And throughout that time, I have been focused on one issue in particular that I have not been as successful on as I would have liked. And that is affordable housing and fair housing. And part of that is I live in an area of Cook County where I think it's absolutely essential that the people who work in the northern suburbs can afford to live in the northern suburbs. By their choice, wherever they want to go, or wherever they want to live, they should have that option, which is currently cost prohibitive at the current time. There are things government can do, which I have been screaming from the rooftops to try and put in place, particularly the transit-oriented developments. There are lots of things I can do, and every time I bring it up, I get blank stares from the powers that be. Well, that's not going to work anymore. We're going to make a change, and we're going to make a change significantly, including in the areas that I represent, because it's essential, because I want my family, the people in my community, to have a diverse and broad-based neighborhood where, you know, the redlining still happens. It still exists, just practically, not by law, but by the function of how we do things in Cook County. And that kind of segregation, in my opinion, just leads to more and more problems that we just ignore or try to brush under the rug. And I feel like, you know, Commissioner Johnson and I came on this board. You're right. Well, I'm a lot older, so I have to get stuff done quickly because I'm not going to be around forever. But I do think we have to focus on this. I am continuing to do it down at the municipal level as it relates to the suburbs that I represent, and obviously we have to keep doing it in the city as well.
So, Commissioner Britton, why don't you tell us some of the suburbs that you represent?
So I represent the north and northwest portions of Cook County, which includes, see if I leave anybody out, Glenview, Northbrook, Wheeling, Palatine, Northfield, Rolling Meadows, Inverness, Arlington Heights, that's most of them, Buffalo Grove. So I basically, if you go from the Edens until you almost hit DuPage County, there's a lot of Republicans out there, by the way, you're going to basically be in my district. So it's a lot of, you know, what would be considered you know, more affluent suburbs. But, you know, it's funny, Karen, I've learned, and, you know, and I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know this as much as I do now. You know, we have really seen the suburbanization of poverty, so that there are pockets in my district that, you know, it's more like the brown populations and actually Asian Americans. And there are lots of areas that are still really significantly economically deprived, and we just don't seem to do anything about it. And being able to afford housing is a big part of that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So fair housing laws are supposed to protect people when they're looking for housing, as well as when they're living in rental housing. What are some of the protections that folks have from landlords? I think, Brandon, you mentioned a few. Commissioner Britton, you mentioned a few in your presentation, but which ones stand out for you, Brandon, as you look at your district, and of course, you have a city and suburban district, and which ones are most helpful, you think, to renters?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I believe the ordinance that Commissioner Britton and Commissioner Morrison led on, and I was happy to join on as a sponsor as well. And I've heard this particularly from the western suburbs the most, where the rent jumps astronomically within the year when the lease is being renewed. Having greater protections there is something that I think is critical. I actually believe that we need to be sharper. And I understand, we live in a capitalistic society and folks are driven by the market. I do understand that. But if you are a family and you're already stretched to the limits to pay rent, and your landlord shows up and says rent is going to jump $400, $500, $600 because they can do it, that can change someone's life dramatically. I know, don't want to get too much in the business of the Rotary, but I appreciate the work that you all are doing with Housing Forward, because this has been a critical challenge that we've had in the suburbs where rent just jumps dramatically. Now, we're obviously seeing that in Chicago with gentrification. I actually believe that we have to have stronger protections there, though there are some. And, there's been some movement around lifting the ban on rent control and giving families the opportunity to at least have some growth with the economy. Because if we don't give families those opportunities to experience growth, if the rent grows faster than families' ability to be able to earn a living, you're going to continue to see the mass force out and push out of Cook County, and that's not good for our body. I mean, and then maybe this comes across a little selfish, and I don't mean for it to do, but if we don't have individuals who can afford to live in Cook County, we're losing taxpayers, right? Which places a greater strain on the few of us that are still remaining. That's another conversation about a more tax structure, because part of the challenge I think that landlords are even experiencing is that for local bodies like Maywood or Bellwood or Palatine or anywhere else in Cook County, because there's such a heavy reliance upon property taxes as a way to generate revenue for the local economy, everyone's impacted by that, right? So if we can't have a fair tax structure, and so local bodies have to rely upon where the easiest source of revenue that they can have access to, and I know Commissioner Britton has to deal with this in his other capacity, it places a strain on everyone. But I believe that the protections that we're beginning to see develop around having some control over the enormous amount of rent that continues to skyrocket is one that I think is warrants even more attention.
Sure, you brought up an ugly 3-letter word, but something we have to live with every day, and that's tax. And then you put a 4-letter word in front of it, fair tax. Landlords would argue that if they're going up on tenants' rent, it has to do with real estate taxes that have skyrocketed. I mean, and they're going to do that. Absolutely, they're going to do that. If they're used to getting a $5,000 a year tax bill, and then all of a sudden, because of the redistribution of whatever that's going on in Cook County is happening, it goes to 10,000. I mean, where I live, oh my goodness. And you can't, it's a balancing act, because you can't stick it to the homeowners, but by the same token, you can't stick it to the businesses either. If you stick it to the businesses, they're going to raise the prices, or worse, they're going to close business there. They're going to move somewhere else where the tax liability is less. So what do you say to landlords who, what are they supposed to do?
So not that the landlords really listen to me much. I'm not their favorite guy at the moment, but I can tell you, I do think that there are mechanisms by which we can try to make that more even. And certainly the Board of Review has addressed a lot of the inequities that may have come out of the most recent assessments, like in the northern suburbs, which we had in 2019. But Karen, I can tell you, a lot of those landlords were not paying what they should have been paying based on the assessed valuation of the property. And I'm sorry, you got a great deal for 3 or 4 or 5 years, maybe longer, but you should pay what you owe. And I had a person in Northbrook who contacted me because his evaluation of his property went up to $2 million. And I said, well, how long have you owned it? And he said, like 6 months. I said, well, what'd you pay for it? He said, $2 million. Well, yeah, that's what you should be paying taxes on. So we have a government that has to run on tax money. We have things we need to spend it on, and we have to do it fairly. But at the same time, it shouldn't be all on the poor homeowner, the individual homeowner who was paying more because some people got sweetheart deals years ago. So let's make sure we just do it fair for everybody. That'd be my suggestion.
I think we were talking about fair tax. That's what we're talking about.
Exactly. Not no tax.
Yeah, no. Certainly, in the area in which I live, I mean, I hear it from both sides. I hear it from the commercial owners of businesses who, I don't know that it was so fair to go from $15,000 to over $100,000. I'm thinking about a golfing range that was in Maywood a few years ago. It's not there anymore. The folks they went out of business because they can't pay $100,000 real estate taxes. But on both sides, I mean, the real estate taxes are very high for individual homeowners, but they're also off the chart for commercial buildings. So
this is why, so Karen, this is why I will just say quickly, is why we have to create a little bit more access to affordability. Because look, and I know Commissioner Britton and I have been working hard to push for a budget that's rooted in equity. The opportunities that we have in Cook County to put people to work and rehab homes and make them affordable so that there are more people in affordable homes that have an equitable distribution of what is required of them as homeowners to contribute to the local economy through property taxes or other forms of taxes. It's not like our country hasn't been able to do that historically, right? It's not like, and I think to Commissioner Britton's point, I don't think we want to lose sight of this, that the type of loopholes that exist for our larger corporations, particularly those corporations that hire over 50 people. We're not talking about, these smaller businesses. Now, some folks would argue 50 employees is a small business. I'm not going to do that today, because I think if you have 50 employees, that ain't how I define a small business, not personally. But if you have more than 50 employees, can we create an opportunity for a tax structure that incentivizes corporations to hire folks, right? And also contribute to the local economy through tax generation and revenue, so that we can put people more to work, that we can put more folks to work, and that we can really rehabilitate these homes. Look, I was able to purchase a home, Clerk Yarbrough, on the basis of me being a public employee, just some assistance for a down payment. You've been a businesswoman your entire life, so you know how critically important it is for individuals to be able to just get that jump start, right? And there were families like mine working every day. I didn't, have a 4.0 like Scott Britton, so I was more of a high C+ B- student, so that limited the amount of scholarship I would have access to. So I accrued some debt. But so you've saved a little money to purchase a home, but you can afford it based upon your salary, but you don't have the down payment, right? Imagine putting people in a position where we have down payment assistance, much like you referenced 50 years ago when the Great Depression era hit. Unemployment for white men was 30%, and our country called it a national crisis. And they literally began to give white men shovels before there was stuff to dig. No one talked about, tighten up your belt. No one talked about entitlement programs, the safety nets. No one talked about that. They said, if we're going to save our economy, we got to give people an opportunity to, one, work, have access to a home. And I think to Commissioner Britton's point, you got to be able to get around. And that's, transportation. So there's ways in which we can address this in an equitable way that give people access to jobs and housing. And then there's a fair distribution of our contribution to the economy through our taxes. So if they would put me in Britton and more folks like us in charge, all of our problems would go away, Clerk Yarbrough.
Oh, sure. oh boy. Okay. So anyway, we only have a few minutes left, but In a sentence, can you tell me what you think the state of the state on housing is in Cook County? How do we stack up in terms of addressing fair housing issues versus other counties?
Well, I mean, compared to our surrounding counties, I think we're all generally in the same boat. But I can tell you that there is not enough going on, and there's not enough commitment at the local level to affordable housing, particularly in the suburbs, and that's where my expertise lies. And Brandon can certainly weigh in on what's going on in the city, but we need to continue to shout from the mountaintops that this is important, and it has to happen. It has to happen now.
Brandon?
I think simply put, every single Saturday, my mother makes sure, like all mothers across the country, we clean the house on Saturday. And we would clean, Karen, we would do our very best, and we would come downstairs, and my mother would always say the same words: "That's a good start." So we would have to go back and go through it again. I think what Commissioner Britton and Commissioner Morrison have done, the work through the Just Housing Amendment, these are great starts to addressing the inequalities that exist. But we have a lot more work to do. As long as there are families that cannot make the ends meet, and that means we still have to address the critical issues that make it very difficult for families to be able to afford to live in Cook County.
Okay, now I don't know if we have any quick questions here from our audience, but I am proud to know both of you, and I am proud of the work that you have taken on. I mean, Scott, when you were talking about, I had some of these fights myself, especially with the realtors, and I am a realtor, and if you can imagine, I didn't get invited to a lot of stuff because they're like, "Oh, you're off on this tangent." But I feel for people, and when people can't get a fair shot, especially when it comes to food, clothing, shelter, and our Rotary Club has focused our attention for the last year when we give out our grants in that area. And I'm glad that our president and the board and our membership decided to do that, because there are a lot of people who are suffering and living in poverty that you would not even believe. I mean, everybody that's homeless is not, under a bridge somewhere. Many of them are, like you mentioned, Commissioner Johnson, they may be sleeping on somebody's sofa. They may be living in somebody's garage. I mean, it's not who you think it is. So I'm really proud to be a Rotarian and working on the issues that we work on to try to, help people wherever we can, however we can. So, Mr. President.
Just unmuting there.
I think you have 2 minutes.
So I just want to thank our speakers as well. Very relevant and interesting. I have a couple of questions, perhaps later on, related to those that own homes in the city. I'm curious about some extensions of Illinois law. We had thought about having our treasurer report at the end of the meeting. With 60 seconds remaining, Susan, perhaps you could send to me or to all the members just a synopsis on where we stand in revenue and expenses for the installation dinner. But I want to, as we end this meeting today, again, not only thank our speakers, thank the coordinator, our president-elect, the Honorable Clerk Karen Yarbrough, for her organization and recruitment of these very, very relevant topics and talented guests. In addition, I want to thank those of you that participated in the installation dinner and that throughout this past year have supported Rotary, and for many of you for many years have supported the work of Rotary. Thank you very much. And I don't know if Gary Wall's on where we can hear him, but just if not, picture the sound of the gong as I call our meeting closed another time, and we look forward to seeing you the next time. God bless you all. Safe travels.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.